Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Sean Kigney. Sean is the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, an international NGO working to mobilize global capital for climate action, and a professor in practice at SOAS University of London. He's a member of the European Commission's Platform on Sustainable Finance and also of green finance committees in China, India, Mexico, and Kazakhstan. Sean will stress the importance of making big shifts in our economy in just 10 years to go clean and green. Discusses the many options for green finance, its ability to drive changes, and how green bond markets work. We'll also talk about what corporations and governments can use green bonds to accelerate the low carbon transition. Hey, Sean, welcome to the show.
Hey, Doug, thanks for having me.
Well, we have chatted before, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. How are you doing? Where are you based at?
Look, I'm sitting in my kitchen in London right now, would you believe? We still have lockdown going in here, and the COVID's going everywhere. We're all hanging out for a vaccine.
Well, it sounds like you guys are about to get the vaccine before anyone else, right? Are you confident that it's going to get to everyone first?
No,
No.
I'll believe it when I see it. The truth is, have we seen a lot of competence on the part of our governments in Western Europe and North America lately around this issue? Not a lot. So we'll just get there when we get there.
Yeah, we're optimistic here, but we all are thinking because of just how poorly it's been handled, we've got a bad couple months ahead of us. But I think there is this optimism that, you know what, they're going to get it out and just it'll be staggered, and they're confident in that respect. So we'll see. Hopefully, some good news out of this awful year.
But we've got to get the health workers and really vulnerable people first. That's going to take us a full 3 months to get to those before we get to the people like you and I that, frankly, we're doing okay. So, but yeah, you're right. And it's interesting, this thing, because there's a link between what we're going to talk about and the pandemic. And one of the things most people don't realize is the origins of this pandemic. I mean, forget all the rubbish in politician stories. The truth is, this is about pathogens jumping between species as a result of degraded environments. This is, if you like, collateral damage from wrecking our environment. We've had a few shots, the MERS virus, the SARS virus. This one broke through. We're kind of lucky that it broke through because this has only got a 1% mortality rate. The SARS virus, if it had broken through, has got a 20% mortality rate. And it strikes people, would you believe, age 30 to 40, not people over 60 like me.
Oh boy.
So I would have been better off. But in a sense, this is a climate crisis because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Health Committee for the last 30 years has been telling us in no uncertain terms, the 21st century is going to be a century of pandemics. When you get climate change throughout history, you get pandemics coming through. We're going to get a lot of these. And what this reminds us is that we've got to look at how we're resilient in our societies in what's going to be a century of climate shocks of all kinds, including wildfires in California, which means it's not just about getting emissions down, which is the near and present issue. It's also about how to make sure that our societies can survive shocks. And there's a lot of learnings out of the pandemic, I'm afraid, a very brutal pandemic, that we need to do to understand how to run our societies better.
All right, well, I guess related to what you're doing here, you've said we have about 10 years to shift our economies to clean energy, to be greener. So why 10 years? Where do you get that? What's happening out there?
So we're not going to shift everything to clean energy, unfortunately, within 10 years, as much as I would really wish we could do it tomorrow morning. Look, it's all about odds and risk. According to the IPCC, which is essentially the global committee of climate scientists appointed by the governments of the world to report back to the UN and to the governments of the world. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, around that. It's not new science, it's a collection of science going around the world. They told us in a major report they published in 2018, they published a major report about every 3 or 4 years, that as best they could see on the modelling, we had done very badly in the previous 30 years. We'd put more emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, into the atmosphere in the previous 30 years than in the 150 years before that. This is the time we were running these UN conferences. We weren't making a lot of progress, unfortunately. And to be able to have a chance of avoiding what they call catastrophic climate change, that's the sort of world you and I and our kids do not want to live in. We need to get emissions down, what they said, 55% by 2030 against 1990 levels. So remember, emissions have gone up, and now they've got to go down. Well, we've got to go down a long way. So it's a little bit arbitrary in the sense that, to be frank, we've never had a world with greenhouse gas emissions as high as they are now while humans have been on the planet. And we're getting worse, and it's going to double by the end of the century. So we don't know what the future holds. Ideally, to be safe, we would kill all emissions tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and we would start addressing resilience issues as to give us a chance. So what the IPCC said is, look, that's not going to happen. We accept that, but we think there's a trajectory to get emissions down to that level by 2030. And we're just saying, okay, we've got to use that as our target. It's possible, it's viable, but there's work involved in doing that. The European Union has now committed to that target, 55% reductions by 2030, as well as net zero by 2050 as the long-term target. The truth is, everyone's got to, the whole world has to, and that's the challenge we face. And if we don't, it is just ugly. It's more than Miami disappearing. It's actually whole parts of the planet becoming uninhabitable. Southern USA gets this wet bulb temperature syndrome that starts happening in summer, where the humidity and heat quotient gets to a point where we stop transpiring. And this is a prediction from the scientists. And when that happens, we die. We have about 4 hours to live, because if you can't transpire, you can't actually survive the heat. And so this is going to become a frequent occurrence at the moment in the 2030s and 2040s. We'll start experiencing quite soon, I think, in modest, for a few days at a time, which could kill 20 million people. That's the trouble. Wow. If you can't get into air conditioning, you die, essentially. So these are the kind of risks we're facing. Now, everything's a risk. Nothing's certain in life. But the risk is very high. Like, you wouldn't drive across a bridge if there was this level of risk of it falling down. And that's what we're trying to deal with. And that's why we're getting this growth of green finance, because investors, who are risk people, right? They're risk people. They're trying to figure out how they can pay your pension when you finally retire, Doug, in 2040. And then managing the money to be able to match assets and liabilities. And what they see is a lot of volatility coming through. So their ability to be able to make sure they can pay your pension when you retire is becoming tougher to achieve. And they're thinking, yikes, what do we do here? And hence we've got this movement about changing portfolios, looking at risk, and also talking to companies that pension funds have shares in to say, can you address this risk a bit? What can you do in your portfolio? It's all about risk, mate. All about risk.
All right. So I guess what you're doing too, and maybe you can use a sector as an example, but you talked about, all right, it'd be great if tomorrow we could just zero out carbon, but that's just not how economies work. And so you have different sectors, most of them relying on fossil fuels as an energy source. So the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's about transitions. And I guess green finance is going to play a role to help these different sectors transition, correct, right? Because most people don't, they think, oh, the scientists say stop, you need to stop doing this. But it's about assisting transitions. And so maybe you could elaborate on that. Maybe there's a particular sector you think is a good example.
Well, if you're an investor, and frankly, if you're a politician trying to run a society too, you're looking ahead to what the risks are that are coming your way. And you try to mitigate those risks and ensure that everyone has a sustainable pathway through life and maximize the outcomes for your citizens or for your beneficiaries if you're a pension fund. That's the challenge. And now what we know from climate modelling and so on, we've got a much greater degree of certainty about what the future looks like than actually we've ever had before, I'm going to say. It's extraordinary. I mean, you see this in weather reports, daily weather reports. We get it wrong, but we get it wrong way more less than when I was a kid. The weather reports when I was a kid were just like whoa. So often you'd say they don't know what they're doing. Whereas nowadays, actually, we can plan what clothes we're going to wear for a reasonable degree of certainty. Well, the same thing applies to climate modelling over the next 20 and 40 years. We've got a great degree of certainty. And what that certainty tells us is things are changing really bad. And in different areas, it means different things. In energy, let's say, it means that we've got to get emissions down. Some governments are getting on top of it. Some things have started changing. And how do we predict those changes? How do we ride the waves to make money? How do we pick an Apple instead of a Ford in terms of our shareholdings in the future to make money? And this is how climate modelling is coming into it, because in some areas, there's some really obvious things, frankly, long-term investments in dredging companies are probably a good idea at the moment, because we're going to see a lot of flooded cities in 20 years' time. But they're all micro. There aren't so many. If there are companies that are making the transition, we have very clear evidence from the last 10 years, the last 20 years, that they have a higher market capitalization or higher share price. Only last month, the value of Next Era Energy in the US overtook the value of Exxon in market capitalization. And you've seen that Tesla is now worth more than the top 6 Toyota companies together. Now, hey, you might think it's a bubble. Hey, it possibly is. But it's interesting, right? Now, there's something going on there. I myself would feel a bit nervous about buying a share in Tesla because it's hard to see that I'm going to get a return on investment. But it does say something about electric vehicles. And I reckon the suppliers, to go back to the gold rush days, the suppliers of the picks and shovels to the Teslas are probably going to be safe bets going forward. So if you're an investor, you're trying to think about this and stay ahead of it, because remember, they're very focused on paying your pension when you retire in 2040. So in this era of climate modelling, we've got 3 kinds of risks that have now become very clear. We've got policy transition risk, and that is, will governments act? Will they go to ban something or push energy policy or maybe promote electric vehicles? We don't know. It's not certain, but there is actually a reasonable degree of certainty. And in fact, one of the things we've been doing is a taxonomy, a guide of what investments are consistent with the Paris Agreement. That's things like electric transport or clean energy or water investments that reduce energy use and also deal with adaptation. There's a bunch of things like this. And in that guide, called a taxonomy, it's effectively a list of things that will not be hit by policy risk. So in fact, it's lower risk. Now, in the fixed income space where I work, most of the time, defensiveness is what it's all about. There's yield demands, but actually what the first job, as Larry Fink says, he made money by making sure investors didn't lose their money. And so defensiveness is the first order of the day. So if you've got a pool of investments, stuff which is consistent with the Paris Agreement, which is how we describe it, which are of less chance of being hit by policy transition, that's gold dust. That's what green bonds are, by the way. They're bonds issued by those kinds of companies or those kinds of assets. And you can address one kind of risk. The second kind of risk is harder, which is physical impacts. Hey, we're feeling it now. Temperature changes, weather changes, bushfires, and pandemics. These are all impacts risks. So we've got to try and assess what are the kind of impacts going forward and how do we mitigate our risk. For example, all the reinsurance companies of the world that are private have withdrawn from writing reinsurance for coastal property in Florida because they think the risks are too high. You kind of know why, right? And so the state of Florida, run by a Republican governor, denies that anything's going on with climate change. They've set up a government-owned reinsurance company that now takes on the risk. In other words, I'm going to call it foolishness about looking at future risk is leading to a foolish decision for Florida. And by the way, Florida has been notched down by Moody's a couple of grades because it's taken on this. It's a AAA state that is less than that because it's taken on essentially the risk of Mar-a-Lago, which gets its reinsurance, as far as I know, from the Florida state reinsurance because no private sector company will touch it. So private investors at the higher level are already acting on some of these impact risks. Some are hard to understand. Pandemic, we've learned a lot about what risks about pandemics are this last year, and it's giving us a clue about how to mitigate risk in the future. Like, guys, everyone needs a health system where the poor get free health on day one of a pandemic. That is, you don't have to keep working triple shifts while you're sick and spreading the disease to make sure you can eat. And that implies some social measures as well. These are climate resilience learnings going out of it. So investors are thinking about that. And now we've got this new risk which has appeared on the horizon, which is a little bit scary, which is liability risk. Because people are starting to win court cases against people who have done things knowing climate change is happening. You know, you've seen the show about Exxon in 1981. Exxon had a team of people working on climate change. They filed a report to the board about climate change saying definitively it was happening and this was going to affect Exxon's future business. And the board buried the report. It's now come out in all the subpoenas of board papers and denied the risk and then started its information campaign. Now, it's up to the lawyers and the courts to decide, but there are actions being brought against Exxon now based on that liability, where a board director did something which was contrary to the evidence they were given about risks going forward. You're going to get a lot of these. Now, for investors, they're now thinking, this company's got a big liability risk which could affect its revenue. You saw this in an entirely separate area when Monsanto was bought by Bayer, and they inherited the Roundup cases, and they downplayed the risk of Roundup. It turns out they've blown up in their faces. They're getting judgments against them. And so, if you like, this is a thing to look at in relation to climate as well. Is there someone that could be blindsided by this? What it means is it contributes to the market capitalization depression of companies that investors think might have a chance of having a risk, and companies that are free of that risk in that universe I mentioned, let's call it the shopping list for the future, they tend to have a higher market capitalization because there's less risk going forward. Very interesting, right? So this is the world we're in now.
What about, I guess, green finance when it comes to the risk on that side? There's this sort of assumption, well, it's helping in the bigger climate change picture, but there are still risky projects. What's happening there? I mean, is there a notion of like there's a higher failure rate when you're kind of taking some risks, or maybe the climate change impact that you were sort of planning for and you were investing in isn't happening as fast as you think? What are you seeing out there? Are green, finance projects as riskier, or a safer bet?
Look, you've still got to do your fundamentals. You've got to work out what your P ratio and all those sort of things are to figure out what the nature of the risk is. This is just an extra risk filter. It's a pretty significant risk filter in the sense that the trajectory is very clear. There has been no situation where climate change as impact has not been as predicted, or in fact worse than as predicted, unfortunately for us. So we've got a pretty clear trajectory. There's a future trajectory we're trying to wrestle with now to try and make sure the 2040s aren't as grim as they're being painted as likely to be. That's essentially what we're trying to do here. So you've got a fair degree of certainty around that. Now, you've still got to take picks on a company, right? If you're looking at a company that's small, is it going to make it? Well, there's an issue about the management there, right? Have they got the capital resources to actually properly exploit the technology set? All those things still apply. The green bond market has grown up with larger companies and development banks and sovereigns. So it's a different kind of class. We're not talking about VCs or small cap exposure in this area. Generally, you can't do a bond in that area. You've got to get equity or a bank loan. So that's a different kind of risk calibration. These are all factors, by the way, but I can't speak of great knowledge because it's not my area. My area is the bonds that are issued by large companies who are looking to transition. So to give you an example, Total, which is actually an oil company, an oil and gas company, issued a bond last month, a green bond, to finance sun power in the US because they happen to own one of the largest solar companies in the world. And they've got very low cost of capital. I'm going to say investors aren't properly factoring the risks there. Hey, what do I care? They can borrow cheap to invest in solar. Fantastic result. And investors like it because it's a company in transition, because they see now that Total is investing quite strongly in growing their solar division, which means they've got a chance of still being there in 10 years if the oil and gas business gets hit by a strong sideways wind, which it has this year in a big way. And it's likely to, there's a good chance, it's all risk, there's a good chance going forward because the Chinese are converting their whole society to electric vehicles and electric transport. They've got a state policy of growing. They've just created a new infrastructure fund as part of their COVID stimulus. It's $1.4 trillion, I think. 57% is going towards electric vehicle infrastructure. That's a big wallop of money. Every single car company in China, from startups to majors, is now only doing R&D on electric and trying to grow. So you kind of see this and you think China, world's largest car market at the moment. Actually, it's a state policy. It saves them money because they avoid oil imports coming through the Straits of Malacca, and they're always convinced that some American Navy fleet could possibly block the Straits and block their oil supply. They're worried about that. It improves the current account situation because less imports. So they've got a lot of reasons to try and make this work. Now, we're betting people, right? We're trying to bet on what the world's going to look like in a few years and how we make money. Got your pension in my mind, Doug. So if the odds are at the moment extremely strongly in favor of the electric transition being way faster than anyone's been thinking, mainly because of China. In 10 years, you'll be going into Shanghai and you won't see petrol cars. You will only see electric cars. Already in Shenzhen, all the taxis are electric, all the buses are electric. This is a city of 20 million people. It's not a small place. Wow. So this transition is underway. Now, the flow-on effect, if China stops importing oil in the scale it is now, transport constitutes 60% of all oil consumption. If you cut off the head of that consumption and reduce it, the price just drops. Now, what that means is if you're an oil company that's producing oil at a marginal price, it's hard to make money now. It's going to be really hard to make money going forward. You're going to lose your shirt. It's going to look like the shale gas companies. So for the whole Alberta tar sands oil industry, big problem. Some of the US industries, Saudi will probably be fine because their cost of production is so low, they can keep making money for another 20 years. But in Saudi, their national strategy involves them, in the words of the Saudi oil minister about a couple of years ago, becoming a solar energy exporter by 2050 rather than an oil exporter. Oops. They've seen the writing on the wall. They're changing. So I'm an investor. I want to get ahead of this.
I got a question from the community room from Ken. How big are these, and what you were mentioning earlier, how big are these exposures globally? Is there an estimate? Hundreds of billions, trillions?
Yeah. It's hundreds of billions. I mean, when I started in this, in the UK, 17% of the capitalization of the stock exchange was oil and gas stocks. It's down now. It's down to 6% because they've lost a lot of value. Not been a good investment. But that's just oil and gas stocks. Then you've got the energy sector, and energy is only about 8 or 10% of what's going to change. So the entire automotive industry is going to shift in the next 10 years. You're going to get losers. I don't know if Tesla will survive in its capex at the moment, but it will survive as a business, and it's probably going to produce more and more cars. General Motors just announced a couple of weeks ago a $42 billion investment in electric production to try and catch up, essentially. It's going to change. And a company like Fiat Chrysler, which has not invested much in electric at the moment, it's a very small footprint, they might have a great deal of difficulty if this changes as fast as it looks. So that gives you a sense of where you're looking at it. But remember where this goes. It's land use. Everything to do with land use, from forests and reforestation to growing maize in the Midwest, is going to have to change. Maize, in case you didn't know, is actually very bad for carbon in the soil. It releases it, let alone the practices involved in it. If you're a Californian that eats quinoa, it's really good for carbon. It sequesters carbon in the soil. These sort of things are going to presage changes. You've seen meat industry, the Impossible Burger. There's been a licensing now of lab-grown meats. This is going to have big implications, of course, for the beef industry. So land use is going to change. Buildings are going to change. We're going to see much more volatile temperatures going forward. And energy costs, people are going to find ways to better manage that within the building envelope. Basically, energy efficiency. It's going to get your energy bills down. That's got to grow dramatically. Cities have to become more sustainable. You're going to see a lot more walking and cycling, more New York and less Dallas going forward, realistically, because that's much more efficient in terms of its footprint around emissions and so on. Where can I stop? Industry. I mean, steel industry. the moment steel is a very large producer of carbon, but it doesn't need to be. We can shift, we've got the technology now to shift steel to more recycling. In fact, US Steel issued a green bond, because I'm here about green bonds at the end of the day, only a week ago, 2 weeks ago, which was to finance electric arc furnaces in the US, which is actually low carbon steel production. But creating new steel has got the same opportunity if we shift to green hydrogen. Now, what that means is you use cheap renewable energy. By the way, solar is becoming so cheap. Unbelievable prices in UAE and India announced last week, the lowest ever auctions in solar. So you use cheap solar in places like Texas or UAE or Morocco, for that matter, to create green hydrogen, which is hydrogen for electrolysis, and then you feed that into a steel plant. And that gives you zero carbon steel. Hey, that's cool. Now we can do this with shipping, we can do this aviation, and that's just a hydrogen story. In plastics and concrete, there are similar stories of how we can get our emissions down really fast, and it's not going to cost extra. It's going to end up being cheaper by the time the cheap energy cuts through. So, it's everything you can think of, Doug. Like, I cannot think of a sector that is not going to be affected by this change going forward. Now, what that means is if you're an investor, I cannot think of a sector where there aren't going to be opportunities and losers.
Well, so Sean, we've gotten to the end of our episode here, but I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. You've covered a lot of ground here, and just as sort of a wrap up, what's next for you? What's on your plate?
Well, we've got a green bond market already of $1 trillion outstanding. Spectacular growth, which are essentially bonds issued against these kind of investments that I'm talking about. And that's growing, and that's everything from BART in San Francisco to new solar plants in India around the world. But it's not enough. We need to have $5 to $7 trillion of this a year to be making real progress. So when you're looking at whether we're making progress, bear this in mind. Scale is everything. Speed is everything. It is only 10 years to change a global society. It's a rather tall order, but the market will grow dramatically. Green equities will become a major story in the next year. Governments are preferencing, central banks are starting to talk in Europe, green quantitative easing, preferencing bonds in this area. And you're going to see retail products which are focused in this area and get special tax exemptions for this area to encourage people to invest. It's going to be an incredible story. And I'm not just talking about the US, I'm also talking about Europe and China and Japan, where the Prime Minister made a net zero by 2050 commitment only a few short weeks ago. This is going to be global, guys.
Well, okay, great. I guess we just scratched the surface here, Sean. Appreciate you coming and share your message. And I guess I'm encouraged by the trend lines here. We have really no choice, right? We've got to transition into a green economy. I want to take you into our just chatting, just to kind of wrap things up with you. I want to close out this episode, but thank you so much for taking the time to come on Simpatico. But we'll be right back. Just hold on one sec.